There's a photograph that doesn't exist anymore. It was taken in rural Tennessee in 1923, outside a farmhouse that's been demolished for 60 years. In it, a woman holds two children. The children look like twins. They're not. One is hers. The other is her sister's. But here's what makes your skin crawl when you look closer at the faded image. The sister is also in the photograph. She's 13 years old, standing beside the woman, holding nothing. The child she gave birth to 7 months earlier is in her older sister's arms now, and by law, by family decision, by the silent agreement of everyone who knew, that baby was never hers to begin with. And this isn't a story about teen pregnancy. This isn't about moral failure or societal judgment. This is about something far more twisted, far more calculated, and far more common than you've ever been told. This is about what happened when families were born too close. When the gap between siblings collapsed into something that shouldn't have been possible, when the architecture of the American family folded in on itself like a house built on a sinkhole, and for over a century, in towns you've driven through, in families whose names you'd recognize, in bloodlines that still exist today walking among us, there was a silent practice, a tradition, an unspoken rule. When a daughter got pregnant too young, the baby didn't disappear. It didn't go to an orphanage. It didn't vanish. It stayed in the family. And the family simply rearranged itself. The grandmother became the mother became the sister, and the baby grew up calling the wrong person mama for their entire life. Sometimes they never found out. Sometimes they did and wished they hadn't. And we talk about family secrets like they're whispered affairs or hidden addictions. But this was different. This was structural. This was a multi-generational conspiracy of silence that required everyone, the father, the neighbors, the church, the school teacher, the town doctor, to look the other way, to nod, to agree, to never speak of it again. And they didn't, until the children grew up, until they started asking questions, until they found a birth certificate that didn't match the story they'd been told their entire lives. And the psychological term for this is family myth. But that word is too soft, too academic. What we're talking about is a form of identity theft that happens inside your own bloodline. It's the systematic erasure of a person's origin story, carried out by the people who were supposed to protect them. And it didn't just happen in the South. It didn't just happen in religious communities. It didn't just happen to the poor. It happened everywhere. In Brooklyn tenements, in Montana ranches, and California bungalows. It happened in your family tree. You just don't know it yet. And because here's the thing about secrets this big, they don't stay buried forever. They leak. They seep through generations like groundwater through a cracked foundation. A deathbed confession, a DNA test ordered on a whim, an old letter found in an attic. And suddenly, a 70-year-old woman discovers that her sister is actually her mother, that the woman she mourned as Mama was actually her grandmother, that her entire understanding of who she is was a performance everyone agreed to stage, and she was the only one who didn't know she was in a play. And the families born too close didn't just break the rules of biology and propriety. They broke something deeper. They broke the covenant of truth that's supposed to exist between parent and child. They built houses on lies and called them homes. And when those houses finally collapsed, when the truth finally surfaced decades later, the destruction was absolute. Because you can lose a parent, you can lose a sibling, but when you lose the definition of what those words even mean, when the map of your own blood becomes unreadable, you lose something that doesn't have a name. And this isn't history. These people are still alive, still discovering, still unraveling, still trying to understand why everyone they trusted decided that the truth was more dangerous than the lie. And in 1891, a girl named Sarah Hutchins gave birth in a farmhouse outside Springfield, Illinois. She was 14 years old. The father was never named, never spoken of, never pursued. Within a week, the baby girl was in her mother's arms. Not Sarah's arms, her mother's, and when the census taker arrived the following spring, the baby was recorded as Sarah's sister, the youngest daughter of the household. Sarah was listed as an older sibling, still living at home, still unwed, still childless. The paperwork was clean, the lie was official, and Sarah spent the rest of her life watching her daughter grow up calling her Sissy. And this wasn't an isolated incident. This was the blueprint, this was the system, and it worked because everyone understood the math. A pregnant 13-year-old daughter was a catastrophe. A 42-year-old mother with a surprise late-life baby was unusual, but not scandalous. The family's reputation stayed intact. The daughter could still marry someday, her mistake hidden, her value preserved. And the child had a home, a name, a place at the table. In the logic of that era, everyone won, except the people who had to live inside the lie, and the practice had a cold efficiency to it. The moment a young girl's pregnancy became undeniable, the family machinery activated. The girl was sent away, to an aunt's house, to a cousin's farm, somewhere distant enough that neighbors wouldn't count the months. The mother began wearing loose clothing, complaining of fatigue, preparing the community for a late-term surprise. When the girl gave birth, sometimes with only her mother present, sometimes with a rural midwife sworn to secrecy, the baby was brought back home as the mother's newborn. The girl returned weeks later, thinner, quieter, her childhood amputated, and life continued. The story was set, the roles were assigned, and deviation was unthinkable. But here's what no one calculated: what happens inside a child's mind when they grow up in a house where the emotional math doesn't add up. When the woman they call mother is distant, dutiful, but cold. When the woman they call sister watches them with an intensity that feels like grief. Children know. They don't have the language for it. They don't have the framework, but they feel the wrongness in their bones. They grow up sensing that the story they've been told about themselves doesn't fit the shape of the love and loss they witness around the dinner table. And psychologists have a term now for what these children experienced: ambiguous loss. The grief that comes from losing someone who's still present, still in the house, still at every meal, but unreachable in the way that matters. A mother who has to pretend to be a sister can't mother. She can't comfort the way a mother would. Can't discipline. Can't claim. Every instinct has to be swallowed. Every time the child cries and reaches for the wrong woman, every time they scrape a knee and run to Mama instead of her, it's a small death, a reminder of what was taken. And it happens every single day for decades. And then the grandmothers, now playing the role of mothers in their 40s and 50s, they weren't equipped for this either. They'd already raised their children, already survived the exhaustion of infancy, the chaos of toddlerhood. Now they were doing it again, but this time carrying the weight of a secret that could never be spoken. They couldn't bond with these babies the way they had with their own, because these babies were evidence, living, breathing proof of family shame, so the love was practical, functional. The child was fed, clothed, sheltered, but the warmth, the kind of irrational, fierce, protective love that a mother has for a baby she chose to keep, that was absent. And children feel that absence even if they never understand why. And the fathers in these families often became ghosts. Some of them knew the truth and participated in the deception. Others were kept in the dark, told the same lie as the rest of the town. But whether they knew or not, their role was the same: maintain normalcy, enforce silence, never ask questions. The families that functioned this way required a kind of emotional lockdown. Feelings became contraband, truth became the enemy, and intimacy, real intimacy, the kind where people are known fully and loved anyway, became impossible. And by the 1920s, this practice was so embedded in American rural and working class life that there were entire networks of midwives and country doctors who specialized in it. They knew which families operated this way. They knew how to record births with just enough ambiguity that the paperwork could support whichever story the family chose. They were accomplices, not because they were cruel, but because they believed, genuinely, that this was mercy, that a child raised in a lie was better than a child raised in shame, that a family's reputation was worth more than a daughter's truth. But the children born into these arrangements didn't feel mercy. They felt haunted. They grew up in houses where something was always wrong but nothing was ever named, where love was conditional on never asking the wrong question, where belonging required forgetting who you were. And there's a letter in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society written in 1947 by a woman named Evelyn Clark. She was 63 years old when she wrote it, and she was writing to a sister she hadn't spoken to in 40 years. The letter is 3 pages long, and it says the same thing over and over in different words. I forgive you, but I can't forget what you took from me. The sister never wrote back. She'd been dead for 2 years. Evelyn had been writing to a ghost, trying to resolve something that couldn't be resolved, because the person who owed her the truth was already in the ground. And Evelyn's daughter, the one she raised as her sister, died without ever knowing. She was 58 years old, married, had 3 children of her own, and went to her grave believing her mother was her sister. Evelyn made sure of it, because by the time she understood the full weight of what had been done to her, it was too late. The lie had calcified into the family's foundation. To tell the truth would have been to detonate it. So she stayed silent, and the silence killed her slowly, the way poison does when you take it in small doses every day for decades. And this is what happened to the young mothers who were erased. The ones who went along with it, who played their roles, who smiled at family gatherings and called their children by the wrong name. They didn't escape consequences just because they obeyed. They paid a price that compounded with interest over a lifetime. Depression that had no name in that era. Anxiety that was dismissed as nervousness or hysteria. A deep, unreachable grief that looked like bitterness to everyone around them. They became difficult women, cold women, women no one wanted to be around, and no one understood why, because no one knew what they were mourning, and the children, now adults, now elderly, who eventually discovered the truth often described the moment of revelation as a kind of death, not metaphorical actual, the person they believed themselves to be ceased to exist. A woman in Ohio found out at 71, after her sister died and she was cleaning out the attic. She found a birth certificate with her name on it and her sister's name listed as mother. She sat on the attic floor for 3 hours, unable to move. She said later that it felt like the house had fallen on top of her. Everything she knew about her life, every memory, every relationship, had to be reinterpreted through a new lens. And the lens was betrayal, and because it wasn't just one person who lied. It was everyone her father knew, her aunts and uncles knew, the neighbors knew. The woman she called mother knew she wasn't her mother and said nothing. The woman she called sister knew she was her mother and said nothing. For 71 years, every person who could have told her the truth chose the lie instead. And when she finally knew, there was no one left to confront. No one left to ask why. No one left to hear her rage or her grief. Just silence. And a house full of photographs where everyone was smiling. And the psychological damage of this kind of deception is profound in ways we're only beginning to understand. Identity formation, the process by which a child figures out who they are, requires a stable narrative. You need to know where you came from to understand where you're going. When that narrative is false, when the origin story is a fabrication, it creates a fracture in the self that never fully heals. Therapists who work with late discovery adoptees, people who find out in adulthood that they were adopted, describe a specific kind of trauma, a shattering of trust that extends beyond the family into every relationship. If the people who were supposed to love you most could lie to you about something this fundamental, who can you trust? What is real? And then the families born too close created a version of this trauma that was even more insidious because the child wasn't removed from their biological mother. She was right there, at every birthday, every holiday, every school play, close enough to touch but forever out of reach. The child grew up in the presence of their own mother and was trained not to recognize her, trained to override their instincts, trained to accept a reality that their body and intuition knew was wrong. That kind of conditioning doesn't just affect one relationship. It affects the person's ability to trust their own perceptions for the rest of their lives. And some of them, when they found out, tried to rebuild, tried to have the relationship they should have had all along. But you can't unmake 50, 60, 70 years of distance. You can't call someone mother when you've called them sister your entire life and make it mean what it should mean. The window for that bond closes, and when it's shut by force, by conspiracy, by a family's decision that reputation mattered more than truth, it doesn't reopen just because the secret is finally out, and others didn't even try. They cut off contact with everyone who knew, burned the family photos, changed their names, tried to build an identity from scratch in their 70s and 80s, which is like trying to build a house after the ground has already eroded beneath it. They died alone often, estranged, bitter, and the families that survived them told themselves it was because she couldn't handle the truth, because she was weak, because she overreacted, never once acknowledging that they were the ones who made the truth unbearable. And in 1956, a woman named Dorothy Brennan walked into a police station in Camden, New Jersey, and tried to report a crime. She was 38 years old, neatly dressed, articulate, and absolutely certain of what she was saying. She told the officer at the desk that she'd been the victim of a conspiracy that had lasted her entire life, that her mother was actually her grandmother, that her sister was actually her mother, that every adult in her family had participated in a fraud that had stolen her identity. The officer listened politely, took no notes, and when she was finished, he asked her if she'd been taking her medication. He suggested she speak to someone at the county mental health office. He did not file a report, and Dorothy left the station and never tried again, because she'd learned what hundreds of others like her would learn over the following decades. There is no legal framework for this kind of theft. No crime that fits, no statute that applies. You can't prosecute someone for lying about who your mother is when the birth certificate was falsified with the cooperation of a midwife or a country doctor 60 years ago. You can't sue for emotional damages when the people who damaged you are dead or elderly or protected by the passage of time. The law doesn't recognize identity theft when it happens inside a family. It just calls it dysfunction, calls it drama, calls it mental illness if you push too hard. But Dorothy wasn't mentally ill. She was right. She'd figured it out through decades of careful observation, through inconsistencies in stories, through the way her mother recoiled slightly every time Dorothy called her that, through old letters she wasn't supposed to find. And when she finally confronted her family, they didn't deny it. They just told her to let it go, told her it was ancient history, told her she was being selfish by dragging up pain that everyone else had managed to bury. They made her the problem for naming the wound they'd all agreed to ignore. And this was the pattern. The ones who discovered the truth and spoke it out loud were treated as criminals for disturbing the family peace. The actual conspirators, the ones who built and maintained the lie, they were protected, defended. The family closed ranks around the secret, not the victim, because to acknowledge what had been done would require admitting complicity. It would require guilt, grief, reckoning, and families built on lies don't know how to do that. They only know how to protect the structure, even if it means sacrificing the person trying to tell the truth. And by the 1960s and 70s, as therapy became more common and people started having language for family dysfunction, some of these stories began to surface. But they surfaced quietly, in therapists' offices, in support groups, in letters to advice columnists that were too disturbing to print. The broader culture wasn't ready to hear them. The narrative around family was still sacred, still untouchable. The idea that parents could systematically lie to a child about their own existence, that entire communities could participate in that lie, that the victim could be gaslit for decades and then blamed for being upset when the truth came out. It was too dark, too ugly. It contradicted everything Americans wanted to believe about family, about innocence, about the past. And so these people suffered in isolation. They found each other occasionally, by accident. A woman in a waiting room would mention something, and another woman would freeze, recognizing her own story in a stranger's words. They'd exchange phone numbers, talk for hours, realize they weren't crazy, weren't alone. But there was no movement, no organization, no public reckoning. Just small clusters of the wounded, trying to explain to each other what it felt like to be haunted by people who were still alive. And the children born from these arrangements, the third generation, the grandchildren who grew up with mothers and fathers who didn't know their own origins, they inherited the trauma without understanding it. They grew up in houses where no one was quite who they seemed to be, where affection was strained, where certain topics caused the room to go silent. They learned early not to ask questions, not to probe. They developed a hypervigilance, always scanning for the thing that was wrong but never named. And when they became parents themselves, they often recreated the same patterns, emotional distance, secrets, conditional love, because it was the only model they had, and this is how trauma moves through bloodlines. Not just through memory or story, but through behavior, through the way we learn to love or fail to, through the rules we inherit about what can be said and what must stay buried. The families born too close didn't just damage the people directly involved. They damaged generations, created lineages of people who didn't trust intimacy, didn't believe in honesty, didn't know how to build relationships that weren't constructed on evasion and performance. And here's the part that should terrify you. We still don't know how many families this happened to. There was no registry, no record. The census data is compromised because it was falsified at the source. Birth certificates were altered or vague or simply wrong. The paper trail was designed to hide the truth, and it worked. Genealogists run into these cases constantly now, especially with the advent of DNA testing. They'll be building a family tree and suddenly the DNA doesn't match the documents. A woman who's supposed to be a great aunt is actually a grandmother. A man listed as an uncle is actually a father. And when they bring this to the family, they're often met with hostility, with denial, with threats, because the secret isn't just historical. It's still alive, still protected, still considered more important than the truth. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you want to know? Would you keep digging? Or would you let the dead keep their secrets? And there's a recorded interview from 1982, part of an oral history project at a university in Pennsylvania. The woman being interviewed is 86 years old, blind in one eye, her voice thin but steady. The interviewer asks her about life during the Depression. She talks about rationing, about making clothes from flour sacks, about neighbors helping neighbors. Then, 40 minutes into the tape, she says something that makes the interviewer go silent. She says, "The hardest part wasn't the poverty. The hardest part was raising my sister's child and watching her pretend she didn't know him." And the interviewer, a graduate student in her 20s, doesn't understand at first. She asks for clarification, and the old woman explains slowly, carefully, that her younger sister got pregnant at 15, that their mother took the baby and raised him as her own son, that the sister, the actual mother, lived in the same house for 18 years and never once acknowledged the boy as hers. And then the old woman says something that the interviewer would later describe as the most chilling thing she'd ever heard. She was good at it. Better than the rest of us. She could look right at him and feel nothing. I think that's what broke her, in the end, not the losing him, the nothing, and the tape ends shortly after. The interview was never published, but it sat in an archive for 40 years until a researcher stumbled across it while studying Depression-era family structures. That one line, she could look right at him and feel nothing. It revealed something that all the other stories hinted at, but never said directly. The families born too close didn't just require secrecy. They required emotional amputation. The young mothers who played the role of sister had to kill the mother inside themselves. Deliberately, systematically, because to feel maternal toward a child you couldn't claim was to live in perpetual agony. So they shut it down, and some of them shut down so completely that they never came back. And there are psychiatric case studies from the 1940s and 50s, buried in medical journals, that describe women institutionalized for what was called melancholia or nervous collapse. If you read the case notes carefully, you can see the pattern. 28-year-old woman unmarried, lives with parents, no history of mental illness, sudden onset of catatonia. 34-year-old woman, severe depression, unresponsive to treatment, obsessive focus on a younger sibling. The doctors didn't make the connection. They treated the symptoms: electroshock, sedation, institutionalization. They never asked about the sibling, never questioned the family structure, never wondered if the depression was grief for a loss that couldn't be named. And then the children, the ones being raised by the wrong mother. Some of them went mad too, not in ways that got them hospitalized, in quieter ways: persistent anxiety, dissociation, an inability to form attachments. They grew up in houses where love was conditional on not knowing, where safety required ignorance. That kind of environment creates a specific kind of psychological damage. The child learns that reality is negotiable, that what they feel and what they're told are two different things, and they're supposed to believe the lie over their own instincts. That's not just gaslighting. That's training someone from birth to distrust their own mind. And some of them became searchers, spent their entire adult lives trying to find the missing piece, the thing that would make sense of the dissonance they felt. They became obsessed with genealogy, with family history, with old photographs and documents. They were looking for proof of what they felt but couldn't name. And sometimes they found it: a baptismal record with the wrong mother's name, a letter that mentioned a pregnancy that officially never happened, a gravestone with dates that didn't add up. And when they brought this evidence to the family, they were told they were mistaken, that they'd misunderstood, that they were causing trouble where there was none. And others became runaways, left as soon as they could and never looked back, cut off all contact, changed their names, built new lives with new identities because the old one felt cursed. And their families called them ungrateful, called them cold, called them mentally unstable, never once acknowledged that the family had made staying unbearable. That love offered on the condition of lies isn't love at all. It's hostage-taking. And by the 1980s, when support groups for adoptees started forming, some of these people found their way into those spaces. But they didn't quite fit, because they weren't adopted in the legal sense. They'd been adopted by their own family, through fraud, through conspiracy, and when they tried to explain this to the group, they were often met with confusion. The adoptees at least had a clean break, a knowable loss. The families born too close had something worse: proximity without connection. The mother right there in the room, but forever unreachable. The loss that never ended because the person never left. And there's a term in psychology now: complex trauma. It's what happens when the abuse isn't a single event but a sustained condition. When the danger isn't external but baked into the structure of daily life. The families born too close created complex trauma on an industrial scale. And because it was normalized, because entire communities participated, the victims had no framework for understanding they were victims at all. They just knew something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. And that feeling followed them everywhere, into every relationship, every moment of happiness tainted by an unnamed dread. And the worst cases are the ones who found out too late, after everyone was dead. After there was no one left to confront, no one left to demand answers from. They were left alone with the truth and nowhere to put it. Some of them went to the graves of the people who lied to them and screamed at headstones. Some of them wrote letters to the dead and burned them. Some of them just sat with it, let it rot inside them, and died a little earlier than they should have. Died of bitterness, died of unresolved grief, died of a wound that had no name and no witness and no cure. And in 2003, a man named Richard Calloway submitted his DNA to one of the early ancestry websites. He was 67 years old, retired, living in Oregon, and curious about his roots. His father's side of the family had always been vague about their origins. Some story about Irish immigrants, maybe some Scottish. The details lost to time. He wasn't expecting anything dramatic. He was expecting percentages, regional breakdowns, maybe a few distant cousins, and what he got instead was a message from a woman in Florida claiming to be his half-sister. She was 73 years old. Her name was Barbara, and according to the DNA, they shared a mother. Not a father, a mother. Richard read the message 3 times before he understood what it was saying. His mother, the woman who raised him, who died in 1989, was not his biological mother. His biological mother was the woman he'd known his entire life as Aunt Helen, and Richard didn't believe it at first. He thought it was a mistake, a glitch in the system. He contacted the company, demanded they recheck the results. They did. The results were accurate. He shared 50% of his DNA with Barbara, which meant they were full or half siblings. And Barbara had documentation. She'd been searching for years, ever since her own DNA test revealed she had a brother she never knew existed. She had letters, she had photographs, she had a birth certificate from 1936 listing Helen Calloway as the mother of a baby boy born in a farmhouse in Iowa and given to her older sister to raise 3 days later. And Richard's entire understanding of his life collapsed in the time it took to read an email. He'd grown up in the 1940s and 50s in a small Iowa town. His mother, the woman he'd called mother, had been stern, distant, dutiful, but never warm. His Aunt Helen had been the opposite, affectionate, present. She came to every school event, remembered every birthday. She'd lived 2 towns over and visited constantly, sometimes staying for weeks. She'd never married, never had children of her own, or so Richard had been told. She died in 1978, and Richard had mourned her deeply, more deeply than he'd mourned his own mother a decade later. And now he knew why. And the psychological devastation of late discovery through DNA testing is creating a new wave of trauma that's only now being studied. Because it's not just that the truth comes out, it's that it comes out suddenly, digitally, without warning or context or support. You're sitting at your computer, maybe curious about whether you're part Italian or part Native American, and suddenly your entire identity detonates. There's no therapist in the room, no family member to explain. Just you and a screen, and the shattering realization that your life has been a performance you didn't know you were giving. And Richard tried to contact the surviving members of his family. Cousins, a few distant relatives who were still alive. Most of them wouldn't talk to him. One cousin told him to stop stirring up trouble. Another said that Helen had made her choice, and it wasn't Richard's place to question it now. A third admitted that yes, some people in the family knew, but it was understood that it was never to be discussed. That Helen had done what she thought was best. That Richard's mother, his sister, biologically, had given him a good life and he should be grateful and let the dead rest in peace. But Richard couldn't let it rest. Because every memory he had was now contaminated. Every interaction with his mother had to be reinterpreted. The coldness he'd felt from her his entire childhood. That was because he wasn't hers. She'd been doing her duty, raising her sister's mistake, and he'd felt that reluctance his entire life without understanding it. And Helen, Aunt Helen, who'd loved him with an intensity that always seemed a little too much, a little too desperate. She'd been his actual mother, watching from a distance, showing up to every milestone but unable to claim him, unable to say the words, and she died with those words still trapped inside her, and the cruelty of it gutted him. Not just that it happened, but that it had to happen in silence. That Helen couldn't tell him even on her deathbed. That his mother, his sister, never softened, never confessed, took the secret to her grave like it was a prize worth protecting, and that the family, even now, decades later, thought the real crime was Richard asking questions. That he was supposed to just accept the DNA results, file them away, and continue living as though his entire foundation hadn't just been revealed as fiction. And stories like Richard's are multiplying. Every year, more people submit their DNA. Every year, more families are exposed. And the pattern is always the same: shock, denial, family hostility, isolation. The DNA doesn't lie, but the families refuse to tell the truth even when the evidence is undeniable. They retreat into vague statements. It was a different time. Everyone thought it was for the best. Why can't you just let it go? As if identity is something you can just let go of. As if finding out your mother is your sister and your sister is your mother is a minor inconvenality, an unfortunate footnote, something that shouldn't really bother you if you were a reasonable person. But it does bother you. It destroys you. Because you realize that every person who ever loved you loved a fiction. They loved the person they told you were, not the person you actually are. And the person you actually are was considered so shameful, so dangerous, that an entire conspiracy had to be built to hide it. You weren't protected by the lie. You were erased by it. And the companies that run these DNA services are starting to include warnings now. Disclaimers. This test may reveal unexpected information about your family relationships. But a warning doesn't prepare you. Nothing prepares you for sitting alone in your living room at 70 years old and discovering that your life was a fabrication, that the people you trusted most were actors in a play you didn't know was being performed, and that when you finally discover the script, everyone who knew it is already dead or refuses to admit it ever existed. And there's a cemetery outside of Lexington, Kentucky, where 3 generations of the same family are buried within 50 feet of each other. The headstones are simple, modest, the kind you see in 1,000 small town graveyards across America. But if you knew what to look for, if you understood the dates and the names and the relationships inscribed in granite, you'd see the map of a lie that lasted 80 years, and the woman buried in the center plot is listed as the mother of 7 children. Her name was Margaret. She died in 1964 at the age of 70. 8 to her right is a smaller stone. Clara, her daughter, died in 1982 at 64. Unmarried, no children listed. But 6 plots down there's another stone. Michael, born 1936, died 2004, son of Margaret, brother of Clara. Except the DNA his grandson submitted in 2019 told a different story. Michael was Clara's son. Margaret was his grandmother. The family had buried them all together, arranged the stones to match the official story, and taken the truth into the ground with them. And the grandson, when he found out, drove to that cemetery and stood there for 2 hours. He said later that he felt like he was standing in a graveyard of ghosts who'd been forced to haunt the wrong bodies. That his grandfather had been buried under the wrong identity. That Clara had been buried as the sister when she should have been buried as the mother. That even in death the lie held. The stones themselves were accomplices, and this is what the families born too close have left behind: graveyards full of false histories. Documents that can't be trusted, photographs where no one is who they seem to be, and descendants who are left to excavate the truth with tools that didn't exist when the lies were constructed. DNA testing, digital archives, forums where strangers compare notes and realize their family's secrets follow the same template. They're archaeologists of their own bloodlines, digging through layers of deception, and what they find is always worse than they imagined. And because it's not just that the secret existed, it's that it was maintained with such precision, such commitment for so long. Every birthday party where the wrong person cut the cake. Every Christmas where the wrong person was thanked for giving life. Every Mother's Day where flowers went to the grandmother and the actual mother had to smile and pretend she didn't feel the knife. Decades of small, deliberate erasures. Thousands of moments where the truth was available and everyone chose the lie instead. And now in 2026, we're living in the aftermath. The last generation that participated in these deceptions is dying. The ones who knew the truth first and who were there when the babies were born and the deals were made, they're in their 80s and 90s now. Some of them are finally talking. Deathbed confessions. Letters left to be opened after they're gone. A few have even reached out to the descendants directly, trying to make amends, trying to explain. But explanation isn't the same as repair. You can't give someone back the decades they lost. You can't undo the damage of growing up in a house built on lies, and the ones who are finding out now, through DNA tests or old letters or deathbed confessions, they're forming communities online, support groups, message boards. They have a name for themselves now, NPEs, not parent expected. It's a clinical term, almost sterile, but beneath it is a shared devastation. They swap stories, compare timelines, help each other navigate the emotional aftermath. And what emerges from these communities is a portrait of American family life that we've never collectively reckoned with. The secret architecture of shame, the infrastructure of deception, the conspiracy of silence that required everyone, doctors, neighbors, churches, entire towns, to participate, and some states are starting to recognize this as an issue, allowing adult adoptees to access original birth certificates, pushing for transparency in family court records. But these laws don't apply retroactively to the informal family adoptions that happened outside the system. There's no legal mechanism to correct a birth certificate that was falsified with a midwife's complicity in 1937. No way to compel a family to tell the truth when all the original participants are dead. The law can't reach backward far enough to touch these crimes, and so they remain frozen in time, unpunished, unacknowledged, except by the people still living inside their consequences. And the question that haunts all of this, the question that every person who discovers the truth eventually asks, is why? Why was the lie considered more merciful than the truth? Why was a daughter's shame more important than a child's right to know their own mother? Why did entire communities agree that reputation was worth more than honesty? And the answer, the one that no one wants to say out loud, is that children weren't considered real people. They were property, extensions of the family name, and their interior lives, their need for truth and identity and connection, didn't matter as much as the family's standing in the community. And that calculation seems monstrous now. But it wasn't done by monsters. It was done by ordinary people. Farmers and shopkeepers and churchgoers. People who believed they were doing the right thing. People who thought they were protecting everyone involved. And that's the real horror. Not that evil people did evil things, but that good people, people who loved their families, who went to church, who helped their neighbors, looked at a young girl holding a baby and decided the best thing to do was take the baby away and make her call it her sister. And then they all went on with their lives, had Sunday dinners, celebrated holidays, pretended nothing had happened. And if you go looking for these stories in your own family, you'll probably find them. The aunt who never married and seemed a little too attached to one of her nieces or nephews. The cousin whose age doesn't quite line up with what you were told. The old photograph where someone's expression doesn't match the occasion. The DNA test that shows a relationship that doesn't fit the family tree. The lies are there, layered into the structure, waiting. And when you find them, you'll have to decide what to do. Whether to speak them out loud or let them stay buried. Whether to be the one who finally tells the truth or the one who protects the family peace. There's no right answer, only consequences. The families born too close taught us that silence is a kind of violence. But they also taught us that truth can be a grenade. And once you pull the pin, you can't put it back. And the dead are gone. The ones who built these lies and maintained them and took them to their graves. But their work remains. In the people still discovering who they are. In the family still fracturing under the weight of revelations. In the graveyards where the stones tell a story that the bones beneath them contradict. And we like to think we're past this now. That we live in an age of transparency. That family secrets can't survive in the era of DNA testing and digital records. But the secrets aren't gone. They're just being uncovered. One test at a time, one old letter at a time, one message from a stranger claiming to be your sibling. And each discovery is a small apocalypse, a world ending, an identity collapsing, a truth that was buried because someone decided a long time ago that you couldn't handle it, and they were wrong. You can handle it. You're handling it right now. By watching this. By listening. By refusing to look away from the thing your family wanted to stay hidden. That's the only way these stories stop repeating. Not by keeping the secrets, but by finally, after all these years, letting them speak.